Welcome to the quarterfinals of UADC 2014. By government, we have UTMARA 2. By opposition, we have NUS 2. This house will pay reparations to families of victims of the slave trade. I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister.
Thankfully, we have reached a point of civilization that recognizes the civil rights movement and implemented racial equality and abolition of the slave trade in the United States of America. Unfortunately, we don't think that legal equality has translated to social equality for African Americans within the United States of America. We think the state-sanctioned slave trade that uses African Americans as human property in the US has had intergenerational harm that until today has trickled down to modern society and affects the socio-economic and education standard for the black community. We believe for those reasons, the state, to correct those past wrongs, they should recognize that an active correcting measure is required to restore and implement equality. However, understand that we're not going to push you that some money is only going to correct all social inequality. We believe above all others is a higher moral principle within the role of the state to recognize that they were complicit within those wrongdoings and make any kinds of measures to correct social inequality. So what do we want to propose from side government? We want the current US governance to, number one, make an active apology for the state-instituted slave trade in the past, but number two, implement a structure that enables reparations to be paid to families of the victims of the slave trade. We think it's already within our expertise to identify the lineage of individuals because the existence of American historians backdates even history itself. We can establish independent tribunals to decide on the amount of reparation that is deserved by each family of those victims in accordance with the level of oppression that they have suffered in modern history and in the past. It is our stance from this government to actively strive to create for social environments that enables equal opportunities to all sectors of society. So before my arguments, some background. We believe this policy is an executive decision to address the Supreme Court's decision in the case of Dredcott. What happened there? An African American demanded for the state to pay reparations due to prolonged discrimination suffered by his family. The state did not want to open a floodgate to the high number due to the high number of African Americans and decided to deny those kinds of legal redressals. We don't think limited resources is a sufficient justification to deny higher, responsible, and moral principles of the state and its mandate to enforce equal opportunities, especially in light of the 14th Amendment, where you recognize that they are deserving individuals and equal under the social structure. So if the judiciary wanted to protect the executive, as the executive, we would like to reject that kind of protection and take liability for the higher moral principles that we believe in. Two things I'm going to talk to you about. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the existence of intergenerational harms that came from the slave trade and why this policy merits and justifies those reparations. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about the role of the state and why that state liability is not displaced due to changing governances. Let's look at existence of intergenerational harms on several levels. Firstly, we think the nature of discrimination is intertwined both on physical oppression and social oppression. Let's look at that physical oppression. We think African Americans, when they were brought to America, not all ended up as slaves. They were concentrated in the South, however, due to the California gold rush, where they had to fight for a lot of metals, so therefore they required a high amount of human resource of which they could not pay remunerations for. So what happened was the federal government passed the Jim Crow law. And these are federal laws where blacks are not allowed to own property. They remove voting rights by putting things such as literacy tests in the ballot boxes when they can't even go to schools, which incidentally push for these black individuals to join the slave trade because they could not feed their families and they could not put a roof over their heads. We think the state had an active element in creating intergenerational poverty then, because there were no means for these African Americans to suddenly get out of the roof that give them those that put meals on those tables, because they're stuck in a vicious cycle. Because if you go out, you cannot get jobs, and nevertheless you cannot feed yourself. So families own generations of slaves who are trapped for sustenance, and they cannot educate their children in order to increase their socioeconomic standing. How does this lead to the kind of social discrimination that is lasting until modern history today? You create generations of harm because when you own generations of slaves, you have instituted and entrenched the kind of social perception to future generations that people who have a black skin color have unequal social status. So at the point in which we fought for liberation for the black community, we have people growing up thinking that blacks were second-class citizens. So even though they could fight for jobs, theoretically, basically, they had no equal opportunities. They couldn't get those jobs, and even those who could got menial jobs, and they never got equal pays. So to some extent, we are able to counter those harms right now with some individuals being able to like becoming the first Black president of America. But we think those are best case scenarios. We think large and across the communities, what we have done over the past generations is force Black communities to retreat into enclaves because there's such a huge extent of social discrimination. So they sought for support systems where we understood. So they retreated into ghettos where collectively they were defined as people with lower rates of education, defined as people with higher criminal activity. Funnily enough, they only suffered those harms because we never granted them those opportunities, but that rhetoric then strengthens the very discrimination that they suffer. We think that side of the house contributes towards that lingering perception, and therefore we can never correct those socio-economic inequalities. So even if they wanted equal footing, those equal footings do not exist. How does our policy even attempt to address this? But before that, yes.
Given that white politicians currently control the amount to be distributed to individuals, how does the small reparation enable a Black person to get hired?
Let's look at how our policy addresses this. Exactly that. For two things. Number one, real financial help. We want to give reparations in direct proportion to the amount of oppression they suffer. So if they absolutely don't have anything, we want to allow them to buy property so that they cannot pay rent. If they cannot educate their children, we want to pay for their education. These are all exact methods to elevate their socio-economic status that directly enables their ability to elevate themselves from these communities. But secondly, even if it doesn't create real help, we think this is an active symbolic correction of that social perception. We think money is an empowerment of that social status. It's a government telling you they merited that kind of social equality to this kind of active measure, and you force their value of equality by giving them the recognition that they deserve. Also recognizing that it's not our burden to solve discrimination, Mr. Speaker. We want to create the best social environments to empower those opportunities to happen. Lastly, why state liability is not the place? Firstly, we think there is an absolute nexus between past governances and the current governances. The political alliances that created the slave trade still exist within the same government structure. The Democrats were the Confederates and the Republicans were the unions. They still were people who are liable with the same political mandates, and therefore a nexus of liability still exists. But secondly, even if there was no nexus, we think there's a higher moral principle of the US to acknowledge their past historical wrong. And this is completely consistent with the kind of moral principle that they impose onto other people. Within the Marshall Plan, United States of America forced Germany to pay reparations to the Jewish community and to Israel, which they still try very hard to pay off until now. They forced the Japanese government to apologize for using comfort women and creating war criminals. Yet all of this, in light of ignoring that they themselves caused similar level graves of breaches of humanity within their past governances. We think the side of the United States loses moral legitimacy on that side of the house when they try to impose and put on their white hats as states while they don't follow and they don't talk the talk, Mr. Speaker. We think this side of the house, understanding there are certain moral principles that you stand by as a governance, when you stand by the 14th Amendment of equal opportunity, this side will not just talk the talk, but we also walk the walk. We're very proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Prime Minister. Next, let's call upon the leader of the opposition. Go ahead.
Understand the context of today's debate, right? Today we think we have a society that, yes, struggles with racism, but we think the causes of racism today is extremely different from the ways that which we saw blacks in the past. We think we also have a society that has progress, where generally slavery is thought of as a period of shame, right? Nobody in America today stands for slavery. If they want a public apology, we think that America has done it, as well as most countries in the world have done it many, many, many times before. But let's see what Mai is really saying within his speech. And these were the two main points. Firstly, the crimes committed by our ancestors can still be held, and our descendants, we continue to remain responsible for the crimes of our ancestors, even though we had a totally different moral calculus in the past. We don't think this is true. Secondly, she said that their effects can continue to be felt today. I'll go on my speech to prove on why these two are untrue. But before that, let me just deal with this little rebuttal that doesn't really fit. Mai wants to raise the socio-economic status of perhaps the black people within America today. We think what they're basically lacking, if you're talking about those who live within ghettos, we're talking about these are people who maybe need a better education system. We think that what they need is for the government to pour in money into these areas, into strengthening welfare, into medical care. We think these are generally things that poor people in America deserve today, regardless of the color of your skin. We also think that it is absolutely fucked up for you to basically come up here and tell us that, like, okay, we're paying you a sum of money, and somehow that is going to raise your socio-economic status. Somehow that is going to be enough for you, for all the racism you continue to face. And as Brian said in his POI, somehow that is going to get you a job. We think that it's a far bigger problem than that. But firstly, let me deal with two main things within my speech. Let me first talk about moral duty and moral debts. Whether or not these moral duties can really be transferred to your descendants. And secondly, let me deal with the problem of paying, right? And why this is intrinsically and principally harmful in the ways that we want to, like the civil rights movement within the United States and the questions about racism to be able to progress. So on the first point, on moral duty and moral debts, right? The first thing I'm just going to come up here and say is really give the somewhat radical proposition that we aren't responsible for the workings of our ancestors. That we think that our ancestors worked on a completely different moral calculus that which we work on today. Okay, we think that what happened last time was if they perhaps saw the black people as maybe beings that were human as second-class citizens. We don't think that's the way in which we continue to view blacks today. We think that it's also fundamentally absolutely impossible for you to continue holding a person of a totally different time period from you, a totally different part of history, to the same kind of moral calculus that which we work in today. We think the kinds of morality that which we live in today is something that we have progressed upon, reflecting upon the mistakes of our ancestors, and maybe with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that the things that they had done are absolutely screwed up. But we think we can't hold them to the same values that we do because they simply didn't know better. Okay, no thanks. Let's look at discrimination today and whether or not this trickle-down effect of discrimination in the past is the same as it is today. We think largely no. For what reason? Because we think that the problem with discrimination in the past was when you refused to see black people as beings that even had souls, therefore they could be slaves, and therefore that somehow escaped the doctrines of Christianity. We saw that was because we think that this is not the same problem that we face today. Through education, we believe today that black people are human beings after all. But what is the racism that they currently face? I think you want to listen to this one. We think the racism that they currently face today is fundamentally different. It's the fact that most people think of black people as lazy, as black people as unproductive members in society, and that's why they're living in ghettos, right? We don't think it has any root from the kinds of slavery that which you want to talk about. No thanks. So let's see, even if we believe that you can pay a moral duty, we think that this debt is an absolutely stupid thing to do, right? Because we think that you want these people, we don't want the idea of us paying a debt somehow means that this can ameliorate any guilt that which the white people of America can feel today. We think that for as long as this is a black stain on history that has many apologies that can't really be erased. We don't think we want them to think that money is something that can be paid off. We don't think that you think that moral debts and moral burdens are something to be paid off. We think what you need to do then is change your history books, is to change the way that which you view black people and basically treat them as decent human beings every day in society. That's the way you pay off a moral debt, not through money. Yeah.
In the 100 years between when slavery was abolished and equal rights were given, white people in America could hoard and cultivate properties, start companies, and get into governments. Do you really think that the stature of black people today have nothing to do with slavery?
No. I mean, partly, yes, and that's why we have policies today with income distribution, right? With welfare and things like that. We think that the harm that which you're talking about is also not just limited to black people, it's also white people who are hurt in the process. There has been inequality perpetuated in the process. We don't think you fix this problem by looking at race in general. If that's a problem in capitalism, that is capitalism. You're going to have to right. So look, let's look at the problem with paying. Three things I'm going to be talking about, right? In principle, why can't we ever pay off its moral debt? Firstly, you will shut them up, right? We think that shutting them up is the exactly kind of thing that you want to do, especially if you still have things about racism that which you want to talk about. Even though I talked about how the baseline ideas of racism between the blacks of yesterday and the blacks of today are completely different, we think that there are plenty of dumb Republicans out there who refuse to recognize that fact. We think that the second, especially with the way Congress currently is not very favorable of redistribution policies for the poor, let alone very favorable of supporting like black people in general. We think that you basically giving them off some kind of debt means that you lose any kind of leverage your civil rights group have within society to push for better rights, especially when racism continues to be perpetuated within society today. Secondly, we think this is deflecting the problem to a past that you are simply not beholden to, right? We think that basically to say that the racism, to try to say that we can pay off the racism of the past, and that somehow means the racism of today is erased in the process. We think this is a huge problem, right? Because if we already understand that there is a fundamental differences in the kind of racism today, it's even more problematic on their side. If you continue the rhetoric that black people are lazy, that black people always need handouts from government, that black people always need that money and that push you get from the government, we don't think it's going to be helping you in the eyes of the poor. We think, in fact, the black people are going to spit on that money for the third reason. Because we have started out treating people as commodities, people whose lives can be traded for money. We think what we're doing is bringing these people back to that. You are basically saying that your lives and your own the lives of your ancestors can somehow be paid off with that money. We reject all of these notions. I'm very happy to work this.
Right, I thank the leader for this. Next, let's follow on the Deputy President from there.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I will answer two questions before I move into my rebuttals. The two principal questions in this debate is whether or not we have a categorical imperative to pay reparations to the blacks. Secondly, whether or not there's a nexus between historic governments in back then and the government of the United States now. Now, first, let's look at the imperative. We think there is a moral imperative on the current government to help black people because, ladies and gentlemen, those black people were disadvantaged in the past because they didn't have access to property, because they didn't have access to social social well-being, ladies and gentlemen. White people had the first mover advantage in terms of acquiring wealth, in terms of advancing themselves in the social platform. We think because of that first mover advantage, up until today, we see black people in the ghettos. It is very difficult for black people to compete with the advantages that white people obtained in the past, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we told you that there is an imperative because the remnants of black inferiority still exist until today. We can see even with the anti-discrimination laws and all the things that they want to support under status quo, we can see that black people are still being discriminated in the workplace, for example. We still have racial profiling where black people are presumed to be more likely to commit a crime. We see the case of Trayvon Martin, for example, being racially profiled, ladies and gentlemen, by virtue of his skin color. Thirdly, we think there is a moral imperative to do this because we have to operate under the presumption that these people or these families would have been better off but for slavery. If they were taken from Liberia, if they were rich in Liberia, ladies and gentlemen, but taken to the United States and lived a shitty lifestyle, ladies and gentlemen, they would have had a better life from the place that they came. And that presumption has to operate because they can't say slavery made their lives better, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, we think there is a moral imperative because we have the capacity to do so. They can't say that America can't afford to do it, ladies and gentlemen. We think they do. We have the legal structures in order to do it. We have the finances to do it. Now, let's look at nexus. We gave you four reasons. Four reasons of why there's a nexus between past governance and government today. Firstly, we think that the government today and the individuals within government and political parties today are people that chose to align themselves with those political parties that goes back to the same political parties that were in existence in the past, ladies and gentlemen. By virtue of you aligning yourself with that political party that were the same people that committed those crimes, you have an obligation, ladies and gentlemen, to correct those political parties, because you still operate under the same ideology of that political party, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, to a large extent, most governments today still operates under the same structures of government in the past, the same constitution, some to a large extent the same laws, ladies and gentlemen. That association is also a reason why we should do this. But secondly, thirdly, you have imposed obligations on others through the Marshall Plan, where you impose the same obligation on Germany. You have imposed the same obligation on Japan. We think you can't be hypocritical, ladies and gentlemen, and because you lose moral legitimacy, you have to walk the talk in order for others to follow through, and that gives you the obligation and the nexus, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, we told you that even if there's no nexus and we accept their argument at best, we still tell you that the benefits are so overwhelming that even if there's no nexus, we should do it. What am I talking about? The Australian government apologized and gave affirmative action to indigenous people in Australia because they recognize the benefits, and it has improved the life of indigenous people, ladies and gentlemen. And we think even when there's no nexus, we think if there is benefits, we should do it. Lastly, we think that there is a concession that was made by Natalie, because she said that we are okay with apologizing, but we are not okay with paying. There is a concession because they are saying that there's no nexus between the current government and the old government, ladies and gentlemen. If there's no nexus, why are you willing to apologize, and why not go to an extent to pay reparation, ladies and gentlemen? Lastly, let's look at the argument of how black people will be perceived as weak if we do this. We disagree absolutely with them, ladies and gentlemen. The perception that black people are weak is in existence within status quo, because black people are seen, and you can see statistics that black people commit more crime, for example, or they live in ghettos and they dominate the lower class of society. That perception of weakness already exists. That argument doesn't juxtapose the condition of black people under the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, and we think to a large extent we help black people in order to do well. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that by you arguing that we are going to have a welfare system in order to help white people, poor white people and poor black people, ladies and gentlemen, it's not good enough. Because you're not taking an active stance saying that we acknowledge our wrong to this particular race, and ladies and gentlemen, apologizing for that, and we think that is harmful, because the condition of poor white people is far better than the conditions of poor black people, ladies and gentlemen, because of the social perception that exists towards black people. The same perception doesn't exist towards white people, ladies and gentlemen, despite the fact that they're poor. Before I move on to my argument, I will take the pretty one.
Even if we have a moral responsibility, we still haven't explained why reparations.
Because to a large extent, it helps them. And the fact that we are trying to do whatever we can, ladies and gentlemen, shows that it is a good gesture, and it shows to the black people that, you know what, even if we're not getting much, at least they're trying to do whatever they can in order to help us. That symbolism is good enough. Now let's look at my argument on how our model puts an end to the anti-white narrative amongst black people. We agree to a large extent that black communities have moved away from the thinking or associating themselves with slavery or feel animosity towards white people, ladies and gentlemen. But the reality is there is race-based delineation even in countries like United States. We see organization in existence exclusive to blacks. We see that race becomes a consideration for politics, for example, when overwhelming majority of black people voted for Obama by virtue of the skin association. We also told you that the black people also place the black card every time they're not given opportunity, and even when they don't get opportunities for legitimate reasons, ladies and gentlemen, they use it as an excuse because they associate themselves as people that were discriminated in the past, and this is continuing, ladies and gentlemen. We think for all of this, we think the refusal to apologize or acknowledge the wrongs, ladies and gentlemen, means that the current generation of white people or the current government, because they haven't actively come out and apologize and pay reparation, ladies and gentlemen, for black people, they feel that there is a tacit endorsement, or they feel that white people think that what happened in the past was actually, legitimate, ladies and gentlemen. This is problematic because we think that black people themselves, under their psyche, will feel inferior, ladies and gentlemen, to white people, and that will what we do is that we put an end to that narrative. Now you can't come out and say, I'm black and that's why I didn't get the opportunity, because there is a symbolism and strong message from the state that we have ended it, we have moved on, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone is one. One Malaysia, one world, one America.
when the Spanish trader went to the Cape of Hope and picked up a group of slaves in the 1830s, and then they proceeded to the United States of America, back then called the Free Land, the guy did not foresee that Jim Crow's law will come into place, will not foresee the civil rights movement, and will not foresee that today that we are still facing the problems of discrimination and so on and so forth. The first question in today's debate is, what is the fair and justified thing to do? What did they say? Firstly, it is no longer debating the motion really, right? Because at some point, if you listen to their speeches, they are saying that this debate is about why we should be nice to like African Americans. Not are we able to prove in the causal chain of events that the current plight of these African Americans is because of That's not true, right? Because the Democrats and the Republicans today are very, very different from before. In fact, there were many moments whereby the key leaders, like key presidents, had to make landmark decisions to reverse the very policy that before. Like for example, we had, Abraham Lincoln had to go against like the kinds of traditions that the previous leaders had on the issues of blacks, on the issues of emancipation out there. So if they have already undertaken the responsibility to make some of the changes out there, then at the most, the best part of the case is that there are some parts of injustices that is still not dealt with. And this is called current day problems, right? So let's talk about some current day problems. Why do we pay for unemployment benefits? Why do we pay for subsidies for retraining? Is it because this guy was a descendant via your tribunal, like a great-grandson of someone who happened to be brought in by a Spanish trader? Or is it because we say that the current government in its current form is unable to deal with some of the systematic disenfranchisement that exists out there? And this is an important point that Natalie talked about. You can't have your cake and eat it, right? Because if you solve the problem because you say there is a lineage problem, then the current government is unable to take on the full responsibility of whatever it has. And even if you were to take you at your strongest, that the current government inherited all the benefits or all the advantages because they committed or they participated in the slave trade in the past, then we say that with all your advantages, you should be able to solve the problems or, like, for example, unemployment out there. Then they will move on to say, but this debate is also about a counterfactual, right? Like, because if you weren't plucked up from Liberia, life would be much better out there. Guys, that's not fair, right? Because even if you take them at their best, the average standard of living of an African American in America is far better than an African still living in Africa out there. But we are not going to thank America for doing so there. Right. The next point is that you impose on a Marshall Plan on Germany, and then you get a Japanese to pay for the comfort woman. Firstly, this is non-analogous. The World War II happened like in 1942. It's like the generation is still ongoing. But more importantly, a large part of the Marshall Plan or all these reparations have already been paid for, and there's a limit to this responsibility because we want society to move on from there. And then when we move on from there, we can re-identify the current problems, and the new government or the government of the day has to solve those problems, not linked to like historical problems. And secondly, if you really want to talk about Japanese women, the last thing that you want to do to a great-granddaughter of a Japanese comfort woman is to pay her because her grandmother has sex over there. That is like revisiting the kinds of links that you really do not want to. Natalie's speech not once responded. Final few arguments, playing the black card, and so on and so forth. First and foremost, you need to say this, right? They say in Shafiq's speech, they will shut up after your particular policy. Two responses. Firstly, if they really do shut up, then your policy will have failed, because there's nothing that you can do to revise history. There's nothing that you can do to show that you're truly contrite. To that money paid to a prostitute is not in any way saying sorry out there. And secondly, even if they do not shut up, there is a problem, right? Because they will ask for more things. And if you already set a precedent that you take on the legal responsibility of the actions of the past, then the next time you do not give any reparations, you'll be seen as like going against your word. You'll be seen as like some atrocities are not as bad as other atrocities. The differential treatment of this is highly atrocious. I'll now move on to my main point of substantive. I'm going to talk about how it is important for us to move on from these kind of issues. The first thing that we want to talk about is this, is that most societies that are really able to progress and most societies who are able to focus on current problems are societies that are move on. Like for example, like in South Africa, whereby they have a rainbow coalition that is able to say that let's have a truth and reconciliation session, but we draw a deadline as to this truth and reconciliation session because there's a need for us to stop blaming each other and stop blaming the forefathers of one another. But before that, yes.
So the Kevin Rudd government apologized for the stolen generation even though he had no part in the past government because it created massive social benefits. So even if the government has no liability, don't you think we should attempt to create a more constructive and equal social environment?
Two responses. Firstly, he apologized and that's part of our policy. And secondly, if the problem of the stolen generation, and this is an important point, if the problem of stolen generation has resulted in structural economic problems, then the government has to solve these kind of problems because those problems not only affect, like for example, the Aborigines, but also people who happen to be the poor whites. Just because the poor whites are maybe a bit better than the poor African Americans doesn't mean that we don't solve poverty as a whole. And this is a massive distraction that we need to talk about. So for these societies to really move on, it is important because if you were to listen to the policy that they're talking about, at some point they say it's more of a principle. That is what Mai talked about. At other points they're saying that let's start to give them a house, let's start to give them a car. An African American, yes, they will obviously be elated if you get a house or a car. Everyone will be, but they will not see it as something that they truly deserve. And secondly, that they will not see it as a sustainable solution for their future generations to come. And that's an important problem because for us to be able to break the intergenerational gap, people will have to see that society has started respecting them. That when they have a car, it's because they are being put into universities, like for example, they are being put in the factory and they earn that particular money. When they say that we want a better treatment for themselves, they are looking at how society, in terms of rights, in terms of the political process, has enfranchised them because that is the kind of future that they envision their children to be living in. A tokenistic giving them all these things will not really make a difference to all the kinds of structural unemployment that plagues the generation. And if you are going to cop out later and say, but that is, at least we give them a car and a house, we say, no, the cost is too great because it's in our policy whereby we look at a needs-based policy, whereby we will probably give you a lot of those benefits anyway, but we give you so for a very different reason, and we sustain the political will to solve the current problems of today.
Right, I have the leaders of the Senate rights for the government.
Mr. Speaker, although slavery was abolished in 1865 with the 14th Amendment, there were multiple structures that prevented the ability of African Americans to progress socio-economically as well as politically. We had the presence of things like the Jim Crow laws, which stopped African Americans from owning property and had things like literacy tests before they were allowed to vote. During the Louisiana Purchase in 1890, this is when white Americans were like buying up large swaths of property across the South, ladies and gentlemen. During the California Gold Rush and the discovery of oil later on, Caucasian Americans were allowed to start up companies, buy shares, and cultivate these lands for their own purposes. For the 100 years that this occurred, ladies and gentlemen, until the Equal Rights Amendment Act in 1965, African Americans did not have the same opportunities as white Americans. This debate, ladies and gentlemen, and as conceded by the side of opposition, requires that we show you that there is some not only complicity within the current government, but a higher moral duty to fix those wrongs. They never wanted to deal with the burden that we push upon them, in which they are okay with apologizing, which seems to me like they are also conceding that African Americans are historically disenfranchised, but not to pay compensation for that. We never saw a nexus between these two things. In my speech today, I'm going to talk to you about the moral duty of the current American government, as well as what's best for the African American community in the long run. Number one, on this moral duty of the state. The opposition contended that, under our model, we are commoditizing the suffering of individuals, as well as we are creating perception that, lives can be bought, or racism can be bought off. On the government, we told you that any government today is complicit for the
States of America, you cannot abdicate yourself from the responsibilities of government in the past. Barack Obama inherited 2 wars. He inherited an economic crisis and vast environmental problems. The president cannot abdicate and disconnect himself from the problems of past governments by saying, just because I didn't do this doesn't mean I shouldn't have to fix the problem. On a third response, we say that when you opt into these structures, we say that you stand for all past policies of the structures, ladies and gentlemen. That's why in America, when you wrongfully convict a prisoner and he spends like 10 years in prison, the court can give him compensation for all those years that he was disenfranchised and all those years that he never had the opportunity to socioeconomically improve himself. They have to tell us why, or whether or not they're okay with things like that, but not okay with our policy. Fourthly, we told you that if there can be a greater utilitarian benefit to this, then complicity doesn't need to be proven, ladies and gentlemen. So that brings me to my second issue. What's best for the African American community? Yes, sure, Natalie.
Okay. So women weren't allowed to own property until fairly late in the 20th century. Are you saying they should be paid the same kind of reparations?
Absolutely, ladies and gentlemen. We are very happy to do that. Thanks, Nat. Secondly, what's best for the African American community? The government side told you, the opposition side told you that this creates a social perception that the blacks need help. We told you on the opposition that this provides better opportunities for them. Number one, we tell you that the idea that it creates a social perception that African Americans need help also applies to any other sort of affirmative action policies that they were apparently happy to fight for. Things like racial diversity quotas in American universities, for example. But secondly, sometimes we can't even help it that these people get that sort of perception because, for example, if you're giving out welfare, an overwhelming number of people who receive welfare will be African Americans, and that kind of perception will always exist anyway. But secondly, to a certain extent, we do agree, ladies and gentlemen, that African Americans were disenfranchised in the past and do require some sort of governmental aid in order to help them make up for all those past progress. But Shafiq explained to you in speech quite brilliantly, man, well done, that this puts an end to all of that, ladies and gentlemen, because it stops this rhetoric that there's some sort of color sympathy in America, that African Americans are always going to be racially discriminated. It takes away this whole rhetoric that America needs an African American president as to put an end to this like decades-old or centuries-old problem, ladies and gentlemen. We think that that all stops here because there can be no other means in which the African American community can now come up and say that we are disenfranchised, that we deserve extra protection, that we need extra help. Under our model, yes, to a certain extent, we do give them that help, but we think that it ends there, ladies and gentlemen. Under your model, they will continue to permeate into society. People can continue using that color sympathy card in order to say, yes, we need more people in power because we've been slaves before, because we've been disenfranchised in the past, ladies and gentlemen. But thirdly, they completely ignored the value of this monetary compensation for these individuals. The fact that your great-grandfather could not vote, could not own shares in a company, could not own land where he could cultivate and grow farm, the fact that he had a master who took all these things from him, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that we give compensation makes up for all of that. If your great-grandfather could not go to university, at least now your child can go to university, get an education, and do better in his life. Because your great-great-grandfather's land was taken away by his white master, you now have the money, the financial capacity, as well as the financial capacity to own property, to cultivate these lands, to buy shares in companies, ladies and gentlemen. Let's understand that this debate occurs in a timeline, and this sort of discrimination happened intergenerational, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that Caucasians hoarded up so much capital assets in America and the blacks were disenfranchised by a period of 100 years, they are not they are not dealing with that harm under their model. At the end of this debate, ladies and gentlemen, let's be very clear. The side of opposition are morally inconsistent. They say we should apologize. They say we should help. But they never told us why not extend that to paying compensation. We told you that compensation, number one, ends this whole perception game that African Americans require more help, but also we told you that monetary compensation gives younger African Americans better opportunities to improve themselves both politically and socioeconomically. They have to tell you why these things cannot happen and why somehow we harm them even more. Ladies and gentlemen, for all these reasons, we're very, very proud to propose.